Brian had always loved restoring old cars. It wasn't just a hobby, it was his therapy, his escape. Before we continue, please take some time to subscribe to Dailydose, like, and share this video. So when he posted online that he was looking for a cheap fixer-upper, he expected a long wait. Maybe someone would know a guy. Who knew a guy who had a rusted-out wreck parked in a barn somewhere? But to his surprise, within minutes, a stranger replied with an offer. Come see a collection of old vehicles left behind by a retired dealer. The man didn't say much, just dropped a location pin and told him to come quickly. It felt unusual, but curiosity won out. When Brian arrived, the sight stunned him. Dozens of worn-out cars lined a fenced lot, battered, weathered, but not entirely useless. And there at the gate stood the owner, an elderly man, polite, soft-spoken, and oddly eager to help. They toured the grounds for nearly an hour. Most of the cars were in terrible shape, missing wheels, broken windows, fire damage, you name it. Brian started to regret the trip, but then the old man led him to a gray BMW. It stood out, aged, yes, but still whole. This one's yours, the man insisted, and I'll give it to you for a quarter of the price. Brian hesitated. Why this car? Why the steep discount? The man wouldn't say. He just smiled and pushed the keys into Brian's hand. Against his better judgment, Brian took the deal. He loaded the BMW onto a tow truck and drove home. It still didn't feel right, but hey, he'd scored a $20,000 car for almost nothing. At worst, he'd replace a carburetor and clean up some mold. No big deal, right? Back in his garage, Brian began his inspection. The car was dusty, sure, and the carburetor was a mess, but it wasn't beyond repair. The body was intact. The undercarriage? Solid. It almost felt too good to be true. Then something strange happened. He tried to call the seller just to say thanks, but the number was disconnected. That same number that worked just hours before was now dead. His gut twisted. Something about this wasn't adding up. Still, Brian pushed forward. He wanted to get a look at the interior, maybe clear out old trash before getting started on real repairs. He opened the glove box and nearly gagged from the smell. Greasy napkins, fast food wrappers, old mirror pieces. It was a mess. But behind it all were 4 heavy gray plastic bags. Brian pulled one out. It was shockingly heavy. Curious and uneasy, he reached inside. The object was hard, cold, oddly shaped. He froze, his hand trembling as he withdrew it, and then he saw it. A brick, but not just any brick. A solid gold bar. Brian's jaw dropped. His knees buckled. Tears filled his eyes, not from joy but from panic. He looked around, half expecting someone to burst through the door and demand the gold back. Were the other bags the same? He had to know. Heart pounding, he opened them all, and they were identical. 4 massive bricks of gold. Alongside them, stacks upon stacks of tightly packed cash. For a moment, Brian just stood there, hands shaking, mind racing. This wasn't just a lucky score. This was something else. Something dangerous. No one just forgets gold and money in an abandoned car. Someone put it there, and whoever it was, they might come looking for it. He considered hiding it, selling it, running. But something deep inside told him that the only right thing to do was to call the police. When the officers arrived, they listened to Brian's story with skepticism. But as soon as they opened the glove box and saw the bags, their expressions changed. "Where did you get this car?" one officer asked, stone-faced. Brian explained everything, the online ad, the old man, the lot of abandoned vehicles. "Take us there," the officer ordered. But when they reached the junkyard, Brian's blood ran cold. Everything was gone. The vast field where Brian had seen dozens of decaying cars earlier that day was now completely empty. Not a single vehicle remained. The dusty gravel lot stretched silently into the distance, eerily still, as if nothing had ever been there. Brian stepped out of the car in disbelief, his mouth slightly open. "This can't be. There were at least 50 cars here this morning. I swear." The officers exchanged skeptical glances. One raised an eyebrow, clearly unsure whether to believe him. But something about Brian's shaking hands and panicked eyes told them this wasn't an act. They moved cautiously toward the only structure left, a small wooden shed at the center of the lot. Inside was nothing but a bare table. No chairs, no tools, nothing to suggest anyone had been there recently, except for one thing. A single envelope sat on the table, and on its surface, in shaky handwriting, was Brian's name. With trembling fingers he picked it up. Inside there was a letter, and what he read chilled him to the core. The note was from the old man. He confessed everything. Years ago he'd owned a legitimate car dealership, until a ruthless gang forced their way into his life. They needed vehicles for a major bank heist, and threatened his family unless he helped. He didn't rob the bank himself, but he became an unwilling accomplice, forced to store the stolen goods in the very cars they'd used. And when it was over, the criminals didn't take the loot with them. Instead, they hid it in the cars, parking them in his yard like ghosts of a crime they never intended to be solved. "I've lived under their thumb for a decade," the letter read. "They watched me, threatened my family, and I could never go to the police, but now I've finally found a way out." Brian swallowed hard. The man explained that Brian's post online was the miracle he'd been waiting for. A stranger, someone with no connection to him, who could unknowingly take the car off the lot and break the chain. By the time Brian discovered the gold, the old man and his family would be gone on a flight to Mexico, far from the gang's reach. And at the end of the letter was one final instruction: check behind the steering wheel. The officers followed Brian back to his garage. With shaking hands he reached behind the dashboard, and there it was, taped and folded, a map. But not just any map. This was a set of coordinates and detailed drawings of another location, one that the police immediately recognized as a suspected safe house for the very criminals tied to the unsolved bank robbery from 10 years ago. That was all the authorities needed. What followed was one of the largest sting operations in the region's history. Police raided multiple locations, arrests were made, weapons, more stolen money, and incriminating documents were recovered. The entire operation collapsed in days, thanks to the evidence Brian unknowingly helped smuggle out. Back home, Brian watched it unfold on the news. He couldn't believe what he'd been a part of. That broken-down BMW in his garage wasn't just a fixer-upper. It was the key to justice, freedom, and a family's escape from terror. Though he never heard from the old man again, Brian hoped he and his family found peace. And as for the BMW, Brian did fix it up. Not to sell, not to scrap. He kept it as a reminder that even in the most broken things, there can be hidden miracles.